Hello and welcome to the Political Dispatch, the podcast that explores the now in context. My name is Tom Spare.
I'm Lily Mott.
And I'm Sid Kuripati. In today's episode, we're looking beyond the Middle East to examine two other regions shaped by division and conflict, Ireland and the Indian subcontinent. If you haven't yet listened to the first part of this series, where we unpacked the history and the current state of the Israel-Palestine conflict, we definitely recommend starting there, as it sets the stage for today's discussion on lessons of peace and partition.
Today, Sid will walk us through how the stories of partition in India and Pakistan in 1947 and the struggle for peace in Northern Ireland both reveal how borders, identity, and political compromise shape the path from conflict to coexistence.
We'll look at what lessons can be drawn from the Good Friday Agreement in Ireland and the enduring tensions between India and Pakistan, and what these examples can teach us about the long road from violence to reconciliation.
Together, they offer insight into how history, diplomacy, and human resilience can either heal or harden the divides that define nations.
So let's begin with one of the most complex and consequential partitions in modern history, the division of India and Pakistan.
So in 1947, the partition of India is one of the most catastrophic and the most mishandled partitions or, exits by a colonial power in recorded history, I would say. It's not something that was caused by ancient religious divisions. Rather, it was shaped by imperial policies that deliberately created and deepened communal rifts for nearly 2 centuries of their rule. As a practice, the British Empire to take over colonies has always applied the divide and rule policy. And in India's case, they systematically fostered Hindu-Muslim tensions as a governance technique. They tinkered with it in 1905 when they partitioned the presidency of Bengal along religious lines with an early template. And though it was reversed in 1911 due to massive protests, it definitely planted the seeds of territorial division based on religious identity. The colonial administration conducted separate censuses by religion, created separate electorates, and implemented policies that treated Hindus and Muslims as monolithic, antagonistic political categories rather than diverse and integrated communities as they had been for centuries. Despite being under different rules of Islamic kingdoms, Hindu kingdoms, and other religious-based kingdoms, these communities coexisted and, thrived. Not to say that there weren't any discriminations that were happening centuries ago, but they still coexisted as a society. The British supported the creation of the Muslim League in 1906 as a counterweight to the Indian National Congress, which became the leading organization for the Indian independence struggle. And this wasn't really accidental. The British continued to follow the policy of the divide and rule and kind of pit the Muslim League against the Indian National Congress and create internal discord. And official correspondence also shows that British officials explicitly discussing how communal division served imperial interests by preventing unified anti-colonial resistance. This is a very important time because it is leading up to World War I and in future World War II as well. And in both cases, the British Empire needed substantial resources in terms of manpower and rations and ammunitions that were being manufactured in the Indian subcontinent at that point in time. If you actually go back to any British monument that is there or that has been dedicated to any battle that has taken place in World War I or World War II, you will always find certain regiments or certain companies from which had Indian origins at that point in time or British Indian origins. In fact, there were a few regiments from India that were posted in the 1916 war, just after the Balfour Declaration, which was happening in the Battle of Haifa, which is a very key moment during World War I. Apart from the divide and rule kind of policy and pitting religion against religion, there is also economic exploitation and institutional neglect that was systematically implemented. So by 1947, Britain had systematically deindustrialized India, transforming it from producing nearly 23% of the global GDP in the 1700s to under 4% by independence in 1947. So the colonial economy was more of an extractive sort of system where raw materials really flowed to Britain while finished goods were dumped back in Indian markets, destroying local manufacturing and so on. And famines increasingly became deadly under the British rule, with the 1943 Bengal famine killing an estimated of 3 million people due to policy decisions prioritizing war supplies over local food security. And famously, it's been quoted by Shashi Tharoor in his book. Shashi Tharoor is former Under Secretary General of the United Nations, also a former minister in India and a current member of parliament, who wrote a book where he quotes that when Winston Churchill was informed about the Bengal famine and the drastic nature of deaths that are taking place, his response was, "Has Gandhi died yet?" So, and that was his level of, apathy to, Indian citizens at that point in time, and his hatred for Mahatma Gandhi. So Britain basically minimally invested in education and healthcare and infrastructure that would serve Indian interests, and literacy rates remained close to 12 to 15% at the point of independence. And India being a really large country and almost hosting 300 million population back then, it was really difficult for the governments to actually take the entire nation together. So this systematic underdevelopment meant both successor states inherited profoundly weakened institutional capacity and impoverished populations. So now we come to 1947, where the partition happens in the most reckless fashion possible. Lord Mountbatten, the last British Viceroy of India, accelerated the independence timeline from June 1948 to August 1947, giving just 73 days between the announcement and the partition. And the Boundary Commission, which has been led by British lawyer Cyril Ratcliffe, for whom the international border between India and Pakistan is called the Ratcliffe Line, had never been to India before and was just given 5 weeks to divide the Bengal and the Punjab regions, which had very deep intermixed populations when it came to Hindu-Muslim populations. So Radcliffe drew borders on outdated maps with inadequate local consultations, creating indefensible boundaries that split villages, families, and irrigation systems. And the borders weren't even announced until 2 days after independence, leaving millions uncertain about which country they were in. And it's important to understand that India gained its independence on 15th of August, 1947, while Pakistan declared its independence on 14th of August, 1947, because they just wanted to have that one particular one-day advantage of some sort. This chaotic sort of partition resulted in a massive humanitarian crisis, which left 15 to 25 million people displaced, which is still recorded as the largest in history, as the largest mass migration. 1 to 2 million people killed in communal violence, and those are just the official figures, though some estimates say higher. Almost 75,000 to 100,000 women were abducted and raped on both sides. Entire train loads of refugees were massacred completely. Communities that have coexisted for centuries, neighbors who used to live with each other for decades, suddenly, were baying for each other's blood. And in all of this chaos, Britain withdrew its troops rapidly, leaving inadequate forces to maintain order. And Churchill reportedly said that Indians were a beastly people with a beastly religion, and that any resulting bloodbath would prove British rule had been absolutely justified, once again revealing the contempt of the underlying imperial policy. Now, there have been many lasting impacts on the subcontinent. briefly, it's the militarization and a perpetual sense of conflict between the two countries, that is India and Pakistan, especially over the kingdoms of Kashmir and Jammu, which officially decided to join India, but was invaded by Pakistan because they refused to accept that. And it being a Muslim majority state, they felt that they had rightfully should have joined Pakistan, but that wasn't the case. They did join India. And then you had UN Council resolutions and Geneva declarations, which basically put in a ceasefire and which implemented what we call today as the line of control, which is the de facto kind of border between India and Pakistan, and where Pakistan took over a portion of Kashmir, which is today called Azad Kashmir, also known as Independent Kashmir. And subsequently, a few years down the line, or maybe a couple of decades down the line, where Pakistan actually was West Pakistan and East Pakistan, they couldn't sustain it, and then led to the Bangladesh Liberation War in 1971, and was the birth year of the country of Bangladesh. So yeah, so the distance between the two countries made it, A, access was limited, B, the only commonality was religion, and C, when they tried to implement the whole idea of one language policy, that modern day Bangladeshis would be speaking Urdu and not speaking Bangla as their language, the people started revolting, and then large scale human rights atrocities were conducted, and that led to the Liberation War in 1971. Additionally, there have been economic consequences, of course. You can see that it has taken a lot of time for all three countries in this region, that is Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh, to kind of reach to a good economic level. While Bangladesh and India have reached to a steady emerging countries economic level, Pakistan has still struggled substantially and is still currently in a massive debt cycle in a sense. There's also been a lot of social fragmentation. The secular and syncretic traditions of the subcontinent, where Hindus attended Sufi shrines, where Urdu poetry bridged communities, where business partnerships crossed religious lines, were shattered, and violence made religious identity a matter of life and death. Yes, a lot of things have reduced, but you have nationalistic governments on both sides of the border at this point in time, which continue to kind of bring those religious divisions and kind of ensure that that remains in the mainstream discourse. Minority communities in both countries have faced ongoing insecurity. Muslims in India, especially in recent years, as I mentioned, have faced discrimination and violence, while the number of minorities in Pakistan have systematically reduced from maybe about 15% from at partition to right now probably less than 2%. And this is all primarily because of colonial mismanagement, that is systematically, weakening of institutions, economic underdevelopment, educational deficits, and the lingering psychological trauma that people have had since partition. And both countries are only 75 years old at this point in time. So we still have generations who have witnessed the partition, who have witnessed the horrors of the partition, or as kids, or have a lot of stories that their parents faced or their grandparents faced. And I get to hear a lot of those from time and again. And it's like a constant reminder what happened back then and what it took to achieve independence, right? Similarly, while this is a partition that still has certain effects lingering, we've had another partition very close to the United Kingdom at this point in time, which is Ireland's partition and its path to peace.
Before you go into Ireland, Sid, I was just something that came to mind was the fact that you had people administrating the partition who had never been to India before.
Yeah.
And it reminded me of Herzl, who'd written the book about the creation of the Jewish state in a land he'd only visited once.
Yeah.
Before, so there's a real lack of understanding of the area which those people are going. These are administrators. This is like, admin staff that have been sent to a faraway place in their minds to do their job, inverted commas, and then do a very bad job. and then also just the extraction aspect of colonialism, which I think is often something that isn't talked about as much, but because we often talk about extraction in terms of people, and we think about slavery, for example, but we don't credit enough towards what empire did in terms of ruining countries. So the British would say, well, we brought administration to India, we brought trains, and we brought cricket, and that's the sort of thing that will be said. But actually, it's the things that were extracted and then sold back. So that's why folks like Gandhi would turn up in Manchester and say, well, the resources that you're using to make and sell back to my country is just not ethical and it's not right. So yeah, I just wanted to throw those few things in.
I mean, to build on what you're saying, the eerie similarities which exist in both cases, and we always kind of say it as like, textbook imperialism or textbook colonialism. But, here are live examples in our history that where, we're seeing the effects, and we're seeing it now in today's day and age as well, despite the UN and, all the literacy that the world has, and the awareness that the world has. Right. Talking about Ireland's partition and its paths to peace. Ireland's partition took place in 1921 and culminated over 700 years of British colonial domination. And just like India, Ireland's sectarian divide was deliberately manufactured through colonial policy. The 17th century plantation of Ulster was state-sponsored demographic engineering that the British Crown systematically disposed native Irish Catholics and replaced them with Scottish Presbyterian and English Protestant settlers. And by 1703, Catholics owned just 14% of Irish land, down from 90% over a century earlier. And these penal laws kind of excluded them from voting, holding office, owning land, or practicing professions, very similar to the kind of laws that were later on implemented in British India as well. The British rules deindustrializing of Ireland outside the Protestant-dominated Ulster took place substantially, and we kind of jump to the Great Famine of 1845 to 1852, which killed 1 million and forced another million to emigrate, reducing Ireland's population by 25%. Again, eerie similarity to the famines that took place in British India as well. And this wasn't a natural disaster. This was a man-made famine. And while potatoes failed, Ireland continued to exporting grain, beef, and dairy to Britain under armed guard. And British officials refused adequate relief, with Charles Trevelyan calling it the judgment of God on an indolent kind of people. The British Empire applied a very similar principle in India as well, where they were forcing Indian farmers to grow indigo plantations, which for 2 years does really well, but then it destroys the soil completely and doesn't allow you to grow anything else, therefore leading to mass suicides and deaths and impoverishment of different farming communities across India. And that's when Gandhi kind of came in 1915. Coming back to Ireland, by the early 20th century, Ulster Protestants had developed a distinct identity tied to the empire. And when Irish Home Rule seemed imminent, Ulster Unionists armed themselves and threatened civil war, with British conservative politicians openly supporting this armed resistance to democratically enacted law. The second section of this would be about the Anglo-Irish Treaty, which in many ways is a poisoned settlement. So following the 1916 Easter Rising, Sinn Féin won a landslide in 1918 and established an independent parliament in Dublin. The IRA, also known as the Irish Republican Army, began guerrilla warfare, and Britain responded through the Blacks and Tans recruited veterans who burned down towns, killed civilians, and conducted extrajudicial executions. And this conflict killed approximately 2,000 people before international pressure, which actually took cognizance of this back then, forced negotiations. So the Irish-Anglo Treaty of December 1921 created the Irish Free State, but partitioned 6 of Ulster's 9 counties to remain in the UK as Northern Ireland. So these 6 counties were chosen to maximize territory while ensuring a Protestant unionist majority would remain. and 3 Ulster counties with Catholic majorities were excluded. The border split the counties, parishes, and farms, and nationalist majority areas within Northern Ireland received no option but to join the Free State. And this led to the designation of Northern Ireland to be a Protestant state for a Protestant people, as Prime Minister James Craig said. And Catholics comprising 35%, large enough to threaten the Unionists, but not large enough for self-determination. You can see the systematic partition that was done over here, ensuring that certain populations were reduced to being more of, representatives rather than, constituents who could enact or could create sort of democratic change in that sense, at least back then. And the treaty split the independence movement and resulted in a civil war between 1922 to 23, killing more Irish people ever than the War of Independence. The second phase of the partition, which was creating a small apartheid statelet of Northern Ireland, districts ensured that Unionist control remained even in Catholic majority areas in Northern Ireland. In Derry, a 2/3 Catholic majority was governed by a Unionist council, and property-based voting excluded many Catholics, while some Protestants received multiple votes. The Special Powers Act gave unlimited detention powers used almost exclusively against Catholics. This is, again, there's a very eerie similarity between this and some of the acts that were implemented in India in 1930s, such as the Public Safety Act, the National Security Act, which kind of gave draconian powers to the government in power at that time to take people into detention for no reason whatsoever. And that was systematically used against Indian population back then. Catholics face systematic employment discrimination as well, with the unemployment being typically double that of Protestant rates. And similarly, housing and schools and neighborhoods were also segregated in these areas. The Irish Republic was too weak to challenge the partition effectively, and periodic IRA campaigns achieved nothing but strengthening Unionist measures, I would say. The last phase, which became far more violent, was the phase between 1968 to 1998. Inspired by American civil rights, the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association demanded basic equality and voting rights, and these modest demands were met with violent resistance from Unionist politicians, Protestant mobs, and the RUC. In August 1969, sectarian riots erupted, the British Army was deployed, and internment in 1971 targeted almost exclusively Catholics. Of almost 350 were arrested during that period as well. And that was on January 30th, 1972, which is also known as Bloody Sunday. British paratroopers shot 26 unarmed protesters in Derry, killing 14 people. And this destroyed the Catholic faith in peaceful protest, which led to the IRA taking the forefront violent measures against the Union government of the United Kingdom. And this led to Westminster imposing direct rule in March 1972. There have been multiple attacks by the IRA across Ireland, as well as some in mainland UK during that period, especially against British forces, while also killing Protestant civilians. Loyalist groups such as the UVF and the UDA primarily targeted Catholic civilians, and evidence suggests that British security forces colluded with loyalist paramilitaries as well. This period killed approximately 3,600 people over 30 years, out of which 52% were civilians and 32% were British security forces and 16% Republican paramilitaries. Now, interestingly, in 1978, the IRA conducted the assassination of a very important person in the British royal family. His name was Lord Mountbatten of Burma, who was also the last Viceroy of India. And That is a very interesting connection to a person who led the partition of India and Pakistan, who was eventually killed by the Irish Republican Army, uh, in a sense which can be looked at as a result of the discord that was sowed by the British government in in Ireland in modern day history. And it's just a very interesting connection that is being made here. There have been multiple attempts at peace initiatives that were tried but have failed, such as the Sunningdale Agreement of 1973 that collapsed after a loyalist strike. 10 Republican prisoners died in 1981. Hunger strikes that took place, and each side could kind of prevent each other from winning, but none could achieve their own goals of peace and independence. However, the Good Friday Agreement, which Tom, of course, knows a lot more about and is probably studied in school as well.
Well, I was at school when it was happening, but so it wasn't history then. It was current affairs and a recent thing, but it wasn't taught. But my perception of the Troubles was very much shaped by my mum's experience. So there was an IRA bombing of a Royal Marine bandstand in Deal, which is near where I grew up, and mum saw the lesser injured that came into the hospital when she was a nurse in the sort of early 1970s. So that really shaped her perception of Northern Ireland and the Troubles. And it was very much, it was happening over the water, but it's not really our concern until the IRA started to attack targets on mainland Britain, because obviously for a long while it was limited to the operations that were going on. But also something to bear in mind that the Metropolitan Police in London was created for a special branch in Ireland. So the Metropolitan Police was created basically to resist or to target Irish folks in London. So there's actually, when there's criticisms of like the Met Police and saying, well, it's colonial power, blah, 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 a lot of people dismiss that. It's not actually true. It was the London Met was created as a reaction to what was going on in Ireland and then replicated in Ireland as a way of not policing the city, but controlling the Irish population in London.
Thank you for that insight, Tom. Coming back to the Good Friday Agreement. So several factors contributed to make peace possible in this case, which was war weariness after 30 years of violence, the growth in Catholic population making Unionist transitions unsustainable, the Republic's booming economy, also the implementation of European Union's cross-border frameworks, and most importantly, the American involvement through Senator George Mitchell and President Clinton. So Sinn Féin moved towards politics, while SLDP provided a nationalist alternative to violence. And in 1993, the Downing Street Declaration established key principles, which was that of self-determination, requiring consent from both North and South. Also, that Britain had no selfish strategic interest in Northern Ireland, and changes required Northern Ireland's consent. This led to the IRA announcing a ceasefire in August of 1994. However, the ceasefire broke down in 1996, but Tony Blair's government re-energized the process in 1997. After intense negotiations through the Holy Week of 1998, parties reached the Good Friday Agreement. Northern Ireland's status could only change with majority consent while allowing for future change. The Republic, on the other hand, removed its constitutional claim, and both Irish and British identities were recognized as legitimate. The agreement created a 108-member mandatory coalition executive requiring cross-community support. The first and deputy first ministers held equal status, one unionist and one nationalist. Cross-border institutions were established, and the agreement enshrined human rights, equality, language rights, and cultural parity. However, controversial provisions included prisoner releases and police reforms, creating the police service of Northern Ireland. Referenda were conducted on 22nd May 1998, which produced 71.1% support in Northern Ireland and 94.4% in the Republic of Ireland. The implementation was difficult as IRA refused to decommission weapons that nearly collapsed the process. However, peace was brought through dramatic achievements. Political violence essentially ceased, investment and tourism increased. Belfast was transformed from a war zone to a relatively normal city. So the Good Friday Agreement didn't erase colonialism's effects on or partition's injustice. It just created mechanisms to manage division peacefully while allowing for future constitutional change through consent. This is something which is more of an improvement in comparison to the India and Pakistan partition that took place. And peace has lasted, which in India and Pakistan's case, peace did not last for a very long time. So what is it that we learn from these lessons from partition? And how is it relevant to understanding Palestine and Israel's partition as well? It really reveals how imperial powers created catastrophes by imposing religious and ethnic nationalism-based policies on regions with far more complex and integrated identities. The second point would be making contradictory promises to different communities to maintaining control, as can be seen both in Irish, in Palestinian, as well as Indian Indo-Pakistan cases. Drawing arbitrary borders, that has been the case in all three partitions. Withdrawing hastily, that was done in both the Palestinian Mandate and India and Pakistan case, and leaving militarized conflicts that have happened in all three cases, two of which are still having militarized conflicts, though one of them, I would say, is a genocide at this point in time. And in all cases, the colonial powers escaped accountability while the people they ruled suffered consequences that has persisted generations later. The violence isn't the result of ancient hatreds, but of deliberate policies and catastrophic mismanagement by imperial powers. So lastly, the path to peace between Palestine and Israel demands what Ireland achieved, but what India and Pakistan failed to achieve. That is genuine equality, mutual recognition, and accountability. This means, in my opinion, a viable two-state solution with a truly sovereign Palestinian state, and not such as pockets surrounded by settlements and checkpoints, but a truly sovereign state. It requires acknowledging and holding Israel accountable for the genocide in Gaza and the systematic discrimination of Palestinians over the last 4 decades, and also the destruction of civilian infrastructure, the mass killings, the forced displacement, and deliberate starvation that constitutes as war crimes under international law. And just as Northern Ireland's peace required acknowledging all suffering and reforming partisan security forces, sustainable peace in the Levant region demands Israel end the occupation and dismantle the settlements, lift the blockade and recognize Palestinians' rights, and face consequences for atrocities that have been committed. This isn't idealism. It's the minimum requirement that history demonstrates, ending partition-related violence and the legacy that partitions have left across the world. So without justice, accountability, and genuine equality, there is no peace, only temporary pauses in generational conflict. If you're interested in reading more about the topics we discussed today, I'd encourage you to read The Inglorious Empire, What the British Did to India by Sashi Tharoor. And we will link that in the description of this episode.
And that brings us to the end of another episode of the Political Dispatch and the end of our 2-part series on conflict and peace.
Over these episodes, we've explored the long and complex history of Israel and Palestine and looked at how the legacies of division in Ireland and India continue to shape politics today.
These stories may be separated by geography and time, but they share common threads. Questions about identity, sovereignty, reconciliation, and what it really takes to build lasting peace.
We want to thank all of you for listening, sharing, and engaging with the series. We hope it's given you some new perspectives to think about.
You can find us wherever you found this episode. Please like, subscribe, and share our show so we can continue to reach more people and drive up interest in these vital conversations. My name is Tom Spare.
I'm Lily Mott.
And I'm Sid Kuripati. You've been listening to the Political Dispatch.